Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Thursday, September the 21st, 2021. A couple of days ago, I did a show with Brian Merchant. He's a tech journalist. He has a new book out, Blood in the Machine. It's a book about the origins of the rebellion against big tech, but it's also a history of the Luddites and of Luddism, and a working class challenge to the idea of work and how we should work. Some people see this as perhaps the origins of the free market, maybe even neoliberalism. I think it's an interesting segue to our conversation today with Elizabeth Anderson. She is a scholar who's spent a lot of time thinking about the work ethic, the philosophy of the work ethic, how it's changed over the last couple of hundred years in the history of the market and capitalism. And she has a new book out, How Neoliberalism Turned the Work Ethic Against Workers and How Workers Can Take It Back. Elizabeth, what do you mean by the work ethic?
Well, in its origins, the work ethic was invented by Puritan ministers in England. And it argued that there are fundamental duties that everyone has: to work hard, to save, to be frugal, not to waste anything, and also to give to the poor. What I argue is that we've inherited only half of the work ethic. Now we call it neoliberalism, the capitalists. But if you go back and read the original Puritans, their objective was actually to uplift the status of workers by sacralizing work. The whole point of their ethic was that it's really the workers who are doing the important, activities for society. They insisted on the equality of all occupations. And that workers were entitled to fair and living wages, safe working conditions, rest on the Sabbath, and importantly, that the poor were entitled to charity so that they could live. So what I argue is that part of the work ethic has mostly not been brought over to the United States. We're living under a neoliberal regime that really only imposed duties on workers, whereas in fact the original Puritans said no, they were really strong, and indeed their model workers were self-employed. They were yeoman farmers and craftsmen.
Who were these philosophers who came up with the original idea of the work ethic? We will talk about Max Weber and his notion of the Protestant ethic, but were these 18th and 19th century philosophers?
So what happened was the work ethic secularized over time. And by the late 18th century, when the Industrial Revolution is starting, that's when these two sides of the work ethic, one imposing duties on workers and the other insisting that workers were entitled to a wide variety of benefits, split off. And they did so precisely because in the late 18th century, with the Industrial Revolution, you see a splitting off of wage work on the one hand, of workers who own nothing and have no entitlements other than to their wage, and capitalists on the other hand who aren't doing the work, they're just reaping all the profits. If you think that your model workers, as they were in the 17th century, were workers who had access to some kind of capital income, Yeoman farmers had their own land, or they had property interests in land. Even merchant sailors were entitled to a share of the commercial profits of any trading voyage. And of course, master craftsmen owned their own shops. Even journeymen owned their own tools. So back in the 17th century, it was normal to assume that workers had access to some capital income, and profits at some level would redound to them. In the late 18th century, with the Industrial Revolution, that regime is ending, and that afforded an opportunity for what we would call today a neoliberal theorists to split off the work ethic and say, no, this is all about enriching capitalists, and workers just have to work really hard in order to enrich capitalists. And that's the version of the work ethic that Max Weber talked about. And that's the version of the work ethic that was inherited by the United States.
So this is the world that Brian Merchant writes about, the Luddites and their rebellion against this new economy. Things change, Elizabeth. That's the nature of the world. The agricultural economy that you describe of a yeomanry changed into an industrial economy. Why do we, or should we, go back to the pre-industrial world since we're in the industrial world?
Well, I'm not arguing that we should go back technologically. What I am arguing, though, is that this other side of the work ethic, a very pro-worker work ethic, was also developed during the Industrial Revolution by somewhat surprising figures, such as Adam Smith, who's usually reputed to be on the capitalist side of things. But in fact, if you read him closely in The Wealth of Nations Sentiments, he's very harshly critical of what today we could call the neoliberal work ethic. He thinks it's based on all kinds of prejudices against workers. And he insisted that if you want workers to work hard, you should pay them more. And he was the leading advocate in his day for high and rising wages. He was a very harsh critic of the predatory practices of monopoly manufacturers and scheming creditors and so forth, just as the Puritans were in the 17th century.
What about other so-called liberal philosophers? I know you write about Paine, Thomas Paine, and John Stuart Mill. Did they also believe that the work ethic was more complicated than simply working as hard as you could within the market system?
Absolutely. Paine, Condorcet, James Mill, his son, John Stuart Mill, all of these people were genuine advocates for workers. And importantly, it wasn't just that they wanted workers to see rising wages. It's also the case that they promoted the agency of workers. They wanted workers to enjoy more autonomy at work. John Stuart Mill was the champion of workers' cooperatives and thought that industrial production should proceed on the basis of worker-managed and owned firms. Adam Smith advocated universal education for workers so that they wouldn't just, have to go straight to work in a state of ignorance and have no opportunities to enhance their skills and their civic knowledge. And of course, we have Ricardian socialists who drove worker control. And finally, another icon in the canon of classical political economy, of course, is Karl Marx. And you can even find in Marx themes of the work ethic. He argued that work was essential to human well-being, that it's a chief source of a meaningful life, but he wanted that work to be unalienated. And what he meant by that, the work had to enhance the worker's skills, It had to be something that workers find meaningful and enjoyable, a field for the exercise of skills that people really like to exercise, and that workers were entitled to recognition for the fact that they're the ones who are producing all the goods by which society runs. So even within the Marxist tradition, you have very strong pro-worker work ethic, or what I call progressive work ethic. And that I argue democracy, which is in the United States.
So if the good guys are Marx and Smith and Thomas Paine and John Stuart Mill, who are the bad guys, the philosophers who you argue stripped the work ethic of any kind of social responsibility?
Bentham and Malthus are my key enemies. Also, Burke. They were all nose to the grindstone theorists. So Bentham argued that poor workers should be held and forced to labor in giant panopticons. Malthus argued for the complete cutoff of social welfare benefits. And again, that was a way to impose precarity on workers so that they would have to accept whatever miserable terms of labor the market offered. And Edmund Burke argued the exact same thing, that workers were not entitled to a penny more than they could earn from their market wage. And if it ended up that they starved, well, so much the worse for them.
What about the arguments, Elizabeth, that within a market system, if the workers organized as they did towards the mid to late 19th century, they organized into unions, they could come to the table and negotiate their wages and working conditions with the owners of capital. Is that an argument that fits into one of these schools in terms of the work ethic?
Well, among the advocates of the progressive work ethic, you see a strong theme of worker self-organization and worker autonomy. Most of them leaned more to worker-owned factories and firms, but some of them were coming more out of the labor union tradition. Notably, Edward Bernstein, who was the founder of social democracy, he pretty much gave up on the idea that worker-managed firms would be viable, but he argued that workers should be organized in labor unions. And if you look at the social democracies at their beginnings, they instituted very powerful labor unions with sectoral bargaining. What that means is that basically, however small union membership might be, they represent all the workers in a sector. And they bargain for uniform wages and benefits for everybody in the sector. And we still see that in places like France, where, you don't have much greater labor union membership than in the United States, but they bargain on behalf of perhaps 85% of all workers in France.
The man who, of course, popularized the idea of the work ethic was Max Weber. His great book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, has had an enormous impact. How does this fit in? The way you're describing the work ethic, you're describing it rather broadly. What's your analysis of Weber's argument that the Reformation generated capitalism because it turned work into a kind of existential dilemma for believers?
Yes, well, I think he gets the work ethic half right. It is true that the Puritans promoted the work ethic in part to enable people to gain assurance of their own salvation. So one of the arguments they gave for why you had to work really, really hard is that that's the only sign that you are really have faith. The faith has to be manifest in your behavior, not just in your hearts. The only way you could really know that God has blessed you with grace is that you observe it in your own behavior. So if you want to be saved, if you want to know that you're saved, you have to be working really hard. So Weber was basically right about that. And he was also basically right about the fact that over time, the work ethic got secularized and turned into an ethic of prudence, where everybody should be working hard and competing with each other to maximize their wealth just for prudential reasons. But it's still the case that he's a very one-sided reader of the work ethic, because he excludes from the work ethic all of the Puritans' preachings against predatory and exploitative business models, all of their preaching against the lazy landlords who weren't doing anything for the Commonwealth, but were like drones in the beehive, eating all the honey, but not really contributing anything, just having sex with the queen. And he fails to trace these more pro-worker attitudes and attitudes that were critical of exploitative capitalism. He fails to trace the development of that tradition through the history of classical political economy.
Some people might argue, Elizabeth, the way you present it is somewhat of a children's story. I mean, to be an owner of capital requires the taking of risk. You've got to own factories, you've got to own land. So there is labor. I mean, this is an old argument that we spend hours, days, years arguing over. The Marxists did, but owning capital involved labor as well, didn't it? And there was a work ethic, and there is a work ethic associated with what today we call entrepreneurs.
So if you look at, there are many advocates of the progressive work ethic who fully recognize the fact that managers, people who are actually directing enterprises, are doing work. But of course, we have huge classes of purely passive capital owners who are receiving dividends and capital gains and so forth and interest without doing a lick of work. And, we have the contemporary neoliberal ideology of the corporation purportedly existing solely to maximize shareholder value.
But you're presenting neoliberalism in a very vague, sort of broad way. Are you suggesting that capitalism is neoliberalism? Because what you're suggesting then is that anyone who owns stock is a neoliberal. Anyone who benefits from the ownership of shares is neoliberal.
So what I'm saying is there were plenty. If you look, say, at the Ricardian socialists, they acknowledge that there's this necessary compensation for people who are managing firms. And later on, classical economists recognize that you do have to charge interest. But the issue is, if you look at the social democracies, for instance, who I think represent the culmination of the progressive work ethic, they were okay with some measure of capital income. And indeed, even in Sweden, you see actually considerable inequality in stock ownership, in wealth, and they're okay with that. But you still have an extraordinarily broad system of social supports and very strong.
I don't understand what this has to do with the work ethic. You're using this term in such a broad way. I mean, what you're talking about in Europe, in Northern Europe, in Scandinavia, are political economies with high taxes and some element of redistribution, which are different from America. But what's that got to do with the work ethic?
Oh, because historically, the social democracies came straight out of the work ethic, right? Historically, the work ethic goes straight through to Marx. It's about enhancing the lives of workers in particular, the people who are actually doing the useful activity in society, and enhancing their agency. And so it's important to recognize that social democracy is not just about redistributing income and wealth. It's about enhancing the agency of everyone and, importantly, decommodifying work. That is, creating a system in which, while everyone is expected to participate and contribute their share of productive activity to society as a whole, they also are entitled to agency, to recognition, to education, and so forth that enhances their abilities. It's much closer to the Marxist ideal of unalienated labor.
And what about people who choose not to work, who are lazy, who don't like work? Should they have the right to their what you call unalienated labor? Should they have the right to leisure?
Well, in fact, social democracy is also a champion of, long vacations to which all workers are entitled. So as society gets richer, the social democrats argued there's less need for people to just work really long hours. If you want to, that's why people are entitled to, 6 weeks of paid vacation in some of the social democracies.
So what are you suggesting for America today? We talked about the Luddites at the beginning of the show. There's an increasing debate about artificial intelligence, whether that's a boon to labor or a replacement for labor. Are you suggesting that America just mimics France or Denmark or Sweden? Because we've had so many shows like that, and it's very unconvincing for cultural reasons and political reasons. It's simply not going to happen.
Well, there are certainly a lot of obstacles to implementing social democracy in America, and I grant that. But, we also see the catastrophe that neoliberalism has wreaked on ordinary workers. The working class has been devastated by free trade and shareholder value maximization. In America, I think there's increasing recognition that we need a reset, that firms aren't just about maximizing profits. They shouldn't be. That, big monopolies need to be broken up. If you go back to the Puritans, they hated monopoly. It's Adam Smith picks up on that
keep
theme.
on saying about who cares about the Puritans now? I mean, what is the point of your book to suggest that the Puritans were right? I mean, whether you're a professor of philosophy, but most people aren't. Whatever the Protestant...
I'm not saying that they were right. What I'm saying is, what I'm trying to do is recover a progressive pro-worker work ethic tradition that has a lot of positive value for workers. And I am, in fact, explicitly contrasting it with alternative views, anti-work views, views that, everybody should just get a basic income. And so we don't have to care about. Do you believe in the idea of a basic
income, Elizabeth? We've done some shows with a friend of mine, Albert Wenger. He believes in what he calls the world after capital. He's a venture capitalist, but he believes that eventually we'll be freed from capital and we'll all be able to realize ourselves with a basic income and that sort of thing. Are you in favor of that? Is technology going to free us, as Marx believes?
I'm very skeptical of that. I think that this is kind of a tech bro fantasy where, they recognize that technology may well lead to mass unemployment, and their solution is just to put everybody on the dole, except for a few billionaires who get, all of the wealth and all of the power. I'm very skeptical of this. I'm not opposed in principle to incorporating some kind of basic income in the overall distributive system. But I do think most people need work. Most people want to contribute more broadly to society. And that's an important part of what makes their lives meaningful. I don't think that most people really are all that happy if they're just partying all the time. That gets dull after a while. And people need fields for the exercise of their talents. Now, of course, these fields don't have to be in the form of wage labor or even paid labor. There's a lot of work that's essential for society, raising children, taking care of dependents. There's also community work that should be recognized and valued, even if it's volunteer and unpaid. There's lots of ways to contribute to the broader society that aren't paid. I actually think that there's a strong argument to pay dependent caretakers, even if they're taking care of family members, so that they're free to do so without living lives of poverty and precarity.